Yes.
All right, good afternoon. Time is now 1:01 p.m. We are back on the record. Where we left off prior to the lunch break was we were on Northwestern Energy's case in chief. Northwestern, do you want to call your next witness?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Northwestern calls Thomas Pankratz.
Mr. Pankratz, I believe you were in the room when we did the mass swearing in, correct? All right, thank you.
Mr. Pankratz, would you please state your name, spelling your last name, and your business address for the record?
Tom Pankratz, Pankratz, Northwestern Energy, 11 East Park Street, Butte, Montana.
And can you provide the commission with your title at Northwestern Energy?
My title is Director of Transmission Engineering and Project Management.
And Mr. Pankratz, did you submit pre-filed direct testimony in this docket?
Yes, I did.
Placed before you is a document that has been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit NWE R3. You could please take a moment to review that and indicate when you are finished.
Okay.
Is Exhibit NWE R3 a true and correct copy of your pre-filed direct testimony?
Yes, it is.
And if I were to ask you here today under oath the same questions that are set forth in that exhibit, would your answers be the same except for any changes or modifications?
Yes, they would.
Do you have any corrections or modifications that you need to make to this exhibit?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Mr. Chairman, I move for the admission of Exhibit NWE R3.
Mr. Uda,
No objection.
Brown. Seeing no objection, NWRE number 3 is admitted.
Thank you. Mr. Pankratz, did you also submit pre-filed rebuttal testimony in this docket?
Yes, I did.
And placed before you is a document that has been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit NWE R4. If you would also take a moment to review that and let me know when you have finished.
Okay.
Is Exhibit NWE R4 a true and correct copy of your pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it is.
And if I were to ask you here today under oath, the same questions that are set forth in that exhibit, would your answers be the same except for any changes or modifications?
Yes, they would.
Do you have any corrections or modifications you need to make to this exhibit?
No, I do not.
Mr. Chairman, I move for the admission of Exhibit NWE R4.
Mr. Uda.
No objection.
All right, seeing no objection, NWER4 is admitted.
Thank you. And with that, Mr. Pankratz is available for cross-examination and questioning.
Very good, Mr. Uda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pankratz, I first wanted to ask you some questions related to power flow data Northwestern used in this case. Are you able to answer those questions?
Yes, I believe so in general, yes.
Okay. I specifically want to ask you about the power flow data Northwestern used in this case to develop its estimate that the new 230 kV line segment from Wheatland to Broadview creates only 90 megawatts of incremental transmission capacity. Can you answer those questions?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. The first of these power flow data sets were provided in response to data request CED-R001 and CED-R005. Do you recall those questions?
Yes, could you repeat the data request number, please?
Sure, it's CED R001 and CED R005.
Okay, I have those before me.
And did you provide those data sets to CED?
Yes,
The second set of the data sets were provided to Mr. Schiffman in response to his and CED's initial request for Wheatland restudy power flow cases. Do you recall that?
yes, I believe so.
Just for everybody's clarification, there's two sets. I'm going to refer to the power flow case used by Northwestern in this proceeding as the line rating data set. The power flow case used in the Wheatland System Impact Restudy as the Wheatland Restudy data set. Do you understand those distinctions?
Yes, I do.
Chairman, if I may just ask Mr. Uda to repeat those.
Sure. I'm referring to the first set, the power flow case used in this proceeding, as the line rating data set. Power flow case used in the Wheatland System Impact Restudy as the Wheatland Restudy data set. Mr. Pankratz, do you agree, subject to check, that in the line rating data set, the three generating units at Dave Gates were modeled with injections of 49.951 megawatts each for a total injection of 148.853 megawatts?
Well, subject to check, I don't recall specifically that generation value at a remote generator to the
Okay.
project.
I understand. And all these questions are going to be subject to check. So if you find out later we were wrong, please let us know.
Okay,
Also subject to check, do you agree that in the Wheatland restudy, the three Dave Gates units were modeled with injections of 43.29 megawatts for a total injection of 129.87 megawatts?
subject to check.
And based on the numbers decided, subject to check again, do you agree that the difference is between 148.853 megawatts and 129.87 megawatts is equal to 18.983 megawatts?
That math sounds approximately correct.
And also, do you agree, subject to check, that in the line rating data set, the 9 generating units at Basin Creek were modeled with injections of 5.819 megawatt each for a total injection of 52.371 megawatts?
Again, subject to check, yes.
Also subject to check, do you agree that in the Wheatland restudy, the 9 Basin Creek units were modeled with injections of 5.416 megawatts for a total injection of 46.314 megawatts?
Okay, subject to check again, yes.
Right. And based on the numbers decided, subject to check, do you agree that the difference between 52.371 megawatts and 46.314 megawatts is equal to 6.057 megawatts?
Yes, again, that math sounds approximately correct.
Do you agree, subject to check, that in line rating data set, the 3 hydro generating units at Fort Peck were modeled with injections of 30? Oh, I'm sorry. What I'm reading, I tend to go too fast. I apologize. Where did you stop? Okay. Do you agree, subject to check, that in line rating data set, the 3 hydro generating units at Fort Peck were modeled with injections of 30.036 megawatts, 12.1 megawatts, and 30.3 megawatts respectively for a total injection of 72.436 megawatts?
Again, yes, subject to check.
Also subject to check, do you agree that in the Wheatland restudy, the 3 Fort Peck hydro units were modeled with injections of 55 megawatts 20 megawatts and 45 megawatts respectively for a total injection of 120 megawatts.
Yes, subject to check, yes.
And based on the numbers just cited, subject to check, do you agree that the difference between 120 megawatts and 72.436 megawatts is equal to 47.564 megawatts?
Yes,
Do you agree, subject to check, that in the line rating data set, the 7 hydro generating units at Thompson Falls were modeled with a total injection of 91.135 megawatts?
again, subject to check, yes.
Also subject to check, do you agree that in the Wheatland restudy, the 7 hydro generating units at Thompson were modeled with a total injection of 80.597 megawatts?
Subject to check, yes.
And based on the numbers just cited, subject to check, do you agree that the difference between 90.135 megawatts and 80.597 megawatts is equal to 9.538 megawatts?
Yes,
Do you agree, subject to check, that in the line rating data set, the 3 generating units at SKQ Gen were modeled with a total injection of 204.169 megawatts?
subject to check.
Also subject to check, do you agree that in the Wheatland restudy, the 3 generating units at SKQ Gen were modeled with a total injection of 180.557 megawatts?
Yes, subject to check.
And based on the numbers just cited, subject to check, do you agree that the difference between 204.169 megawatts and 180.557 megawatts is equal to 23.612 megawatts?
Again, the math sounds approximately correct.
Do you agree, subject to check, that in the line rating data set, the 6 generating units at Hauser were modeled with a total injection of 17.509 megawatts?
Yes, subject to check.
Also subject to check, do you agree that in the Wheatland restudy, the 6 generating units at Hauser were modeled with a total injection of 15.481 megawatts?
Again, yes, subject to check.
And based on the numbers just cited, subject to check, do you agree that the difference between 17.509 megawatts and 15.481 megawatts is equal to 2.028 megawatts?
Yes,
You agree, subject to check, that in the line rating data set, the 4 generating units at Holter were modeled with a total injection of 47.344 megawatts?
subject to check, yes.
Also subject to check, do you agree that in the Wheatland restudy, the 4 generating units at Holter were modeled with a total injection of 44 megawatts?
Yes,
And based on the numbers just cited, subject to check, do you agree that the difference between 47.344 megawatts and 44 megawatts is equal to 3.344 megawatts?
yes,
I promise I'm almost done with this. This is as torturous for me to read as for you to listen to. Also subject to check, do you agree that the line rating data set and the Wheatland restudy data set, there were also generation injection differences for renewable projects, including Montana Sun, Apex, Greenfield Wind, Fairfield Wind, and Big Timber Wind?
well, I don't recall specifically varying generation rates at those particular ones, no.
Okay, so I just want to be clear. I'm giving you the opportunity to check on that. So if you were to find that there was a mistake there, please bring it to our attention. Subject to check, do you agree that in the line rating data set, the generation injection at BPA's Grand Coulee Hydro Generation Facility was 523.409?
Subject to check, yes.
Again, subject to check, do you agree that in the Wheatland restudy data set, the generation injection at Grand Coulee was 613.978 megawatts?
Subject to check, yes.
And based on the numbers just cited, subject to check, do you agree that the difference between 523.409 megawatts and 613.978 megawatts is equal to negative 90.569 megawatts.
Yes,
That mean in the line rating data set, BPA's Grand Coulee Hydro Station is producing 90.569 megawatts less than it was producing in the Wheatland restudy data set.
Mr. Root, I would have to review that particular study in detail to remember those types of numbers, et cetera.
Okay. Does it seem plausible to you that Grand Coulee would be generating 90.569 megawatts less in one data set than the other data set?
Mr. Root, I guess I'm not clear on where the line of questioning is going. I'm not sure the relevance of Grand Coulee to the local area of central Montana.
Okay, did you include Grand Coulee in your power flow study?
Grand Coulee is not specifically included in Northwestern's power flow studies. What Grand Coulee, if you will, is included as is what referred to in planning terms as the slack generator. So as we model the Montana transmission system, we have to look at various make various assumptions about import flows, et cetera. So that's the purpose, if you will, in a Montana transmission model of Grand Coulee, as you refer to.
Right, but Grand Coulee is in Washington, right?
Yeah, I would say northern Washington, yes.
And does it make sense to you that between time one?
Mr. Uda, I don't mean to thank you.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
Does it make sense to you that between the first study and the second study, that all of a sudden Grand Coulee is just generating 90 megawatts less?
Well, possibly it does, yes.
And what would be the basis for that statement?
Well, I believe you're referring to two separate software models that were developed. And, you're depending on between the two different models, there's often you'll find different variables of generation resources that are modeled within those particular different set of models. So again, unclear where and failed to see maybe the tie between that and perhaps transmission capacity in central Montana. I would submit to you that I don't believe that generation in central Washington would have an impact on the potential transmission capacity in central Montana northwestern system.
So it's your testimony before this commission that Grand Coulee does not appear in the load flow studies for the Wheatland project.
Again, as I stated earlier, Grand Coulee is a generator that's included in the model that is referred to as a slack generator. And you'll find that in various transmission models that are meant to model a local area. So in terms of a local area to Northwestern, that would be the Montana transmission system. And transmission planners doing various study work will need to ultimately, set generation values, et cetera, at remote locations. And in this case, as you refer to, Grand Coulee.
Okay, so my understanding of the purpose of these load flow studies is to make injections at certain points in conjunction with a new generator in order to see how that changes load flows over the system. Is that generally right?
I'd say that's partially correct, yes.
Part of it is correct.
Well, what part of it isn't perhaps correct is, what we're generally referring to. There's multiple different types of transmission planning studies that ultimately occur. In the case of a generation interconnect study, as the case with Wheatland, it's really more about injecting the new generation request. In this case, it would have been Wheatland into the transmission system and then running what we refer to as contingency analysis to make a determination about the reliable operation of the transmission system.
Right. So you have this decline in generation in the model at Grand Coulee. Do that so that you could get the load flow studies balance.
Mr. Uda, I did not personally make the transmission planning model. That would have been occurred by one of Northwestern's transmission planning engineers that reports to me. However, I would submit that, again, the value of a generator in Western Montana is irrelevant, frankly, to the amount of capacity that available in central Montana.
Right, but my understanding of these load flow studies is the whole point is you can't solve unless you get it to balance. If you add something somewhere, you have to either take something out somewhere else. Balance, right?
Yeah, and that's generally correct. Yes, there is a balance between loads and resources, correct.
So if you have Grand Coulee generating 90 megawatts less, could that have an effect on the load flows in the state of Montana?
I'd suggest it would have very negligible effect on any of Northwestern's underlying transmission system. It may have an effect on the larger 500 kV transmission system, for example.
And it's Northwestern system is a system, but it's interconnected to other systems, right?
Correct.
So the 500 megawatt line at various points interconnects with other transmission, one kind or another. It's either owned by Northwestern or someone else. Right?
Yes, Northwestern has various transmission interconnects through across Montana. We refer to these as our path interconnects, and out to the west, as you're referring to, is what we generally refer to as path 8.
Okay. And can you confirm that Northwestern's line rating modeling, it concluded that the new 230 kV line segment from Wheatland to Broadview would increase total transmission capacity by just 90 megawatts?
Yes, that's correct. That's what's in my testimony.
Okay. And would you agree with me, again, subject to check, that the 90 megawatt line that's added at Wheatland is roughly the same amount as the 90 megawatt 0.569 decrease at Grand Coulee?
Well, if you're asking me if the numbers are the same, yes, 90 is the same in both locations.
Okay. In operating its power system, if Northwestern saw additional generation injections onto the 230 kV transmission system in the vicinity of the Wheatland project, do you believe BPA would reduce its generation at Grand Coulee in response in order to keep generation and load on the Northwestern system in balance?
I couldn't answer that, sir.
You know that if BPA has an obligation to do that?
I do not believe they do, no.
And in fact, Grand Coulee and other generators on BPA system have contractual and other obligations they must serve independent of Northwestern. Isn't that right?
Bonneville has separate obligations than Northwestern in some respects. Yes, I would agree with that. I would also add, though, in terms of your prior question, is Northwestern operates within its own balancing authority, separate from the Bonneville Balancing Authority.
No, I understand that. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to figure this out. Under the prior system study, prior to the restudy, the first system impact study, the existing 230 kV line had a capacity of 480 MVA roughly. Is that correct?
And when you refer to the first study, could you clarify that for me, please?
The first system impact study, the one that went to arbitration.
If I recall correctly, yes, that system impact study had proposed mitigation of a new 230 line from Broadview to Great Falls.
And that line, according to the Supreme Court, would be a quote, significant addition to a long distance transmission corridor with a capacity disproportionate to Wheatland's output. Is that correct?
I believe that's what the Supreme Court ruling indicated.
And would you agree with me that subject to check, and now instead of Wheatland paying 100% of the KV line, Wheatland is paying for roughly 83% of a new line at a cost of $67 million?
Yes, subject to check, I believe that that was the allocation methodology and numbers that were a result of that percentage allocation. I believe Ms. Mueller may have more detail on that.
But if there's only 15 additional megawatts that can be injected into that new segment of the 230 kV line without causing other transmission system issues, why did you build it at 15 additional megawatts?
Mr. Ruder, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Not sure it was a good question. Let me ask it this way. So they're going to build a 90 megawatt segment of a new 230 kV, but a 90 megawatt segment of a new 230 kV, correct? That's the proposal.
Yes, the proposal is a line that adds what was calculated as 90 megawatts of transfer capacity to the system.
Right, but Wheatland is only injecting 75 megawatts, correct?
Correct.
So if Wheatland is paying for 83% of the line, why doesn't Wheatland own it?
I'm not sure I can answer that question, Mr. Ruda. I think that Wheatland would have an option to perhaps seek another solution if they wanted to. They could build their own line to a stronger location that wouldn't require transmission upgrades.
Okay, that's good. But if Northwestern had done the study such that 230 kV line all the way from Great Falls to Broadview was still needed, the denominator for cost responsibility of Wheatland would go from 90 megawatts to 230 megawatts, correct?
No, I don't believe that actually is correct.
Okay, but it would be 230 at 480 MVA though, right?
No, I don't believe that actually is correct. The way to allocate that.
Well, no, I'm not saying you agree with it, but I'm saying like if Northwestern had decided not to build this 90 megawatt segment and instead had decided to build the whole 230 kV line as they had before, Wheatland's cost responsibility would go down because the denominator would go up. Is that correct?
No, I don't believe that is correct. No.
Okay, where am I going wrong? What's wrong with my logic?
Well, first of all, I mean, through the study at hand and the mitigation that was determined was, the bare minimum, if you will, required mitigation to bring the Wheatland project online was determined to be, just as we referred to, this partial 230 kV segment from Broadview to the POI at Wheatland. What was proven in the study work is that to bring Wheatland on, an additional segment of line was not necessary. We didn't need to go all the way to Great Falls.
Okay. But I'm saying like, if you had just built the line the first time, like what you wanted to do prior to the Supreme Court's order, it was a 480 MVA rating. The denominator would have gone up and Wheatland's cost responsibility went down.
Well, again, I don't know that actually is accurate because while it's perhaps the denominator may have gone down, what is unknown, and we did not calculate out, is what would be the actual transfer capacity gained on the system if we were to build the entire 230 line from Broadview all the way to Great Falls. It is incorrect to assume that one would use the thermal value of that particular line segment to make that calculation.
Okay, but whatever it was, it would have been bigger than 90 megawatts.
I believe that would be accurate, yes.
Right, so instead of us paying 83%, we would have been paying some lower amount. That right?
I can't determine that.
Isn't it just math?
The allocation methodology is generally just math, yes.
So is there something wrong with my math is what I'm trying to figure out. Is there something wrong with it?
Uh, Perhaps not your math, Mr. Uda, but in terms of the understanding of transfer capacity. What is unknown is what would the total transfer capacity gained on the transmission system? In other words, how much capacity would be built into the system if Northwestern were to build this entire new 230 line from, say, Great Falls to Broadview? It is not, one cannot use just the thermal rating of that particular line segment, say 480 megawatts, or as we've referred to, 478 megawatts is the anticipated thermal rating of that transmission line. We don't know what the total transfer capacity would be. That would have to be calculated, sir.
Okay, but there's nothing wrong with the math. The denominator is increased, cost responsibility goes down.
I believe that's correct based on the allocation.
Are there any batteries on any of the projects senior to Wheatland in the queue?
I believe that there are, however, Otto Mueller may have more detail on that in terms of all the number of different projects. Sir, we have literally hundreds of interconnection projects in the Northwestern's queue.
Are you aware specifically of a wind battery project that's senior in the queue, Wheatland?
I believe that there is one or two. Again, however, I'm not familiar with that particular detail or the name of the project.
So for your study, did you assume that the batteries had any capability to absorb any of the generation along that line?
No, that would not be part of our generation interconnection procedures.
Given the number of projects in this transmission path, and we've heard a lot about it here today, why didn't you just do a cluster study of all the projects and assign cost responsibility that way?
Well, Mr. Rudy, that's a good question. To the point about cluster studies, Northwestern has considered using cluster study methodology. However, that would also require a FERC tariff to allow Northwestern to change its procedures. I do believe that there's some pending FERC language that may require moving towards cluster studies in the future. However, our current practice is and has been to study various projects on a independent basis.
So is the Yellowstone County gas plant connection queue to Wheatland?
I believe it was, yes.
And yet you studied Wheatland together with Yellowstone, correct?
Well, if you're referring to Wheatland being a senior queue project, we would have studied them with the Yellowstone project with Wheatland included, yes.
Okay, but question is, did you study Wheatland together with Yellowstone? Even though Yellowstone is junior in the queue?
We would have considered it within that as a matter of our queue practice and queue management with all of the studies, yes. However, I don't believe that the Lewistown area, or as we refer to as Central Montana, or the Lewistown pocket, is a different generation pocket, if you will, than say the Billings area.
But isn't it the case that study that you performed in this case includes Yellowstone as a junior queued project in the study for Wheatland?
I believe that is correct. To clarify my statement, what I understood you to say, did we study them together? We would have studied them together from the standpoint of studying the junior Q project, i.e. Yellowstone. We would have included the Wheatland project there as well.
Okay, but I think my question is simpler. When you did the interconnection study for Wheatland, did you include the junior queued Yellowstone project?
Objection asked and answered.
I think I've gotten an answer to that yet.
I'm going to overrule that. Go ahead, Mr. Lee. I think that's actually a more precise question than what he was
That's
asking.
probably, I believe.
Thank you.
So did you understand the question?
No, please repeat it.
Okay, so when you did the interconnection study for Wheatland, did you include in that study the junior queued Yellowstone project?
Oh, I don't believe we would have done that.
So if we have it and we can see that it's there, that's a mistake.
Subject to check, yeah. I don't believe that it's in there though.
I think I asked Mr. Kaplan this question earlier, but I think I'm going to take another run at it with you. Could a lower voltage line such as a 69 kV line carry 75 megawatts of generation?
It's probably plausible to construct a 69 kV line that would take that much capacity. Yes, be a pretty big one.
Another question is, I noted from your testimony that you did injections 5 megawatts at a time. Is that correct?
That was the methodology we used. Yes.
Is that Northwestern standard practice?
As I think I outlined in my testimony, no, it's not our standard practice.
And it sounded like from your testimony, it's not the way you normally do that. Is that correct?
The incremental generation increases that we use to try to determine the allocation methodology was a result of the Montana Supreme Court ruling. So it was a methodology and proposed to ultimately determine how much capacity could be available on with the proposed mitigation. So.
Well, I'm confused though, because I didn't see anything in the Montana Supreme Court order that said you're supposed to do ejections 5 megawatts at a time. Is there some place I can look at where you see that?
Probably not, but there was no instruction that I'm aware of to how does one determine that. So the issue of 5 megawatts was a value that our planning engineers looked at to try to be as granular as possible to make a determination of how much transfer capacity would be gained. One could have used 1 megawatt, one could have used 50 megawatt increments, but we felt 5 megawatts was a reasonably low enough value to attempt to make that determination, if you will, find that breaking point on the system.
Well, why did you assume 5 megawatts as opposed to any of the other values you just mentioned?
Again, it seemed like a fair value of low enough increments. One could use 1 megawatt, one could have used some other value, but 5 megawatts we felt was a relatively standard low value enough to attempt to get granular enough to make that determination where that transfer capacity limit would be.
Right, but it sounds like you were using 5 megawatts at a time because you knew you were pretty close to getting thermal overloads in your study. I mean, if not, you could just have used 50. Right?
Again, one could use various values, but it is accurate to say that we were relatively aware of the amount of capacity that could be gained in terms of our planning engineers that are quite knowledgeable about their work.
What amount of injection at a time did Mr. Schiffman?
I don't recall off the top of my head. I'd have to look at his testimony.
Do you agree with me? It was 50 megawatts of injections at a time, subject to check.
Subject to check.
And Mr. Schiffman did not find any thermal outages until 550 megawatts of additional injections. Would you agree with that, subject to check?
I believe that was his testimony, yes.
This is just. Right. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I wanted to hand the witness something that we will be calling CEDR 001. It'll be our first hearing exhibit, and it is the local area transmission plan for Northwestern. May he approach?
Yes, you may approach.
Mr. Pankratz, I've handed you a document that says it's entitled 2019 Local Area Transmission Plan. Are you familiar with that document?
Yes, I am.
Did you cause this document to be prepared, or was it prepared at your direction?
Yes, it was.
So I wanted to ask you a few questions about it, but first I want to move this as an exhibit into the hearing.
Ms. Norcott.
Mr. Chairman. I guess one point of clarification, is this not already in the record that the commission took administrative notice of at the beginning of the hearing?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe the 2020 plan is in the record already. I'm unsure if the 2019 plan.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I didn't hear if Mr. Chandler said he wasn't sure if
Yeah,
this
the
prior.
2020 plan is in, sorry, the 2020 plan is in the record in CDR 019A. I have not seen the 2019 plan anywhere in the data responses.
Directly relevant to this line of questioning.
Could you repeat your statement right there?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm leaning back. I would like to move its admission into the record. It's directly relevant and related to the subsequent transmission plans.
No objection. Just wanted clarification. I appreciate it.
Mr. Brown?
Can you please turn to page?
Hold on.
Oh,
You're
sorry.
right. CED-R001 is omitted.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Mr. Rubin.
On page 14, when discussing low voltage condition, is it true that Northwestern lists, quote, loss of Judith Gap 230/100 kV auto transformer causes widespread low voltage on the Stanford, Lewistown, and Harlowton 100 kV and 50 kV systems mitigation plan in place? Does it say that?
Yes, it does say that.
Okay. First question. In the study you completed here for the Wheatland project, do you agree that the loss of the Judith Gap 230/100 kV auto transformer is included in Northwestern's N-2 contingency definition?
Before you answer that question, if I may voir dire the witness, Mr. Udo, could you explain to the commission what N-2 means, please?
Yeah, well, President Brown, I'll do my best. N-2 refers to a contingency analysis. Transmission planning engineers like to use all these analogies, but we start with what we refer to as N-0. So that's N-0, meaning that's a normal situation. All lines, all elements of the system are in service, nothing out of service. Okay. So part of, and that's the basis of our reliability based analysis. We start with all system in service, then we take various contingencies. So N-1 refers to system normal minus one element of the system out of service, and we run various different analysis of those. N-2 to the question is system normal minus two elements.
Thank you. You may proceed, Mr. Udo. I'm sorry to.
Oh, that's okay. I had that same question. So my question was, in the study you completed here for the Wheatland project, do you agree that the loss of the Judith Gap 230/100 kV auto transformer is included in Northwestern's N-2 contingency definition?
Objection ambiguous. I don't know which study you're referring to.
I believe it's the study that is being advocated here by Northwestern. Does that help?
So under your, Mr. Udo, Mr. Chairman, what you were calling the line rating?
Yeah, it's the,
Study?
well, it's the power flow data is the line rating, but this is the whole study. That helps.
Does that answer your question, Ms. Norcon?
Sort of. I'll see if the witness understands.
Right. Well, I think I said that. So do I need to repeat that question again?
Please do.
Okay. In the study you completed here, which would include both the power flow and interconnection study for the Wheatland project, do you agree that the loss of the Judith Gap 230/100 kV auto transformer is included in Northwestern's N-2 contingency definition?
As a point of clarification, I don't believe we refer to it as an N-2. Generally, more generally, we refer to this as an N-1. So not to get even more technical yet, but the loss of the Judith Gap transformer, as you refer to, yes, is a critical outage that is included in Northwestern study work for the Wheatland project or any other project in the central Montana area. But the term N-1, I'll make the distinction. What is -1 versus -2? The N-1, which is really the situation that we're in the central Montana area with the Wheatland project, is the first N-1, and I describe all of this in my testimony, is the loss of a section of the 230 line that Wheatland is asking to interconnect to between the point of interconnection and Broadview. When that loss occurs, it overloads the system north of the point of interconnection. So I draw that distinction because it's important here, because it's not just about the Wheatland interconnection. We have to recognize that there's, as you described earlier, a number of senior queue projects also in Northwestern's queue ahead of Wheatland. So in these events, when these overloads occur, even with the inclusion of Wheatland, there's north of, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 megawatts of generation that's connected to that system in the central Montana area. And when that occurs, we go into voltage instability issues. It's not just a thermal issue, because system protection devices will automatically trigger taking off the Judith Gap transformer as you described. So I just wanted to make that important distinction in terms of what we're referring to when we refer to N-1 and that event happens, and then there's automatic protection devices that are act to protect the system, maintain reliability for as many as customers, and maintain system reliability on the transmission grid that takes the Judith Gap transformer out. So I wanted to make that distinction.
Okay. Could you describe for the commission the mitigation plan Northwestern identified in its 2019 local area transmission plan?
Mr. Root, I'm not sure that I can do that because I'm not sure if we did identify specific mitigation for the issue you described in the 2019 plan.
Does the study indicate that there will be mitigation or that there has been mitigation?
The study indicated mitigation is planned.
In the modeling completed for Wheatland, both the revised system impact study and the power flow modeling completed by Northwestern in this case, was the mitigation plan identified in the 2019 transmission plan implemented when studying, I'm going to try to use it correctly, the N-1 contingency definition used by Northwestern?
I don't believe that it was. I make a clarification around the 2019, the local area plan, because I think that, sir, in my opinion, these are two totally separate functions. What Northwestern does to study and analyze the reliability of its existing transmission system, that's what occurs in a local area plan. That is an entirely different planning process than generation interconnection study work. Those two functions are done completely separate. So I wanted to make that important distinction. What is not included in local area planning is generation interconnect, for example, is not included in a local area planning process.
But when you're doing a generation interconnection study, shouldn't you be taking into account mitigation you've already planned for a local area transmission system?
Generally, yes, Northwestern does take into account with the GIA if we have planned mitigation in place. To this point and to page 14, as you referenced in the 2019 plan, I'm not aware that we ultimately concluded any potential mitigation in the area, or I should say, not aware that we concluded any actual mitigation. The other thing that this is not in the local area planning process, this is also not Northwestern's investment or capital plan. So the local area planning process is meant to inform our system and do our best analysis in terms of what the 5, 10, and 15-year look of the system is, in terms of operating that system reliably now and into the future to serve our existing customers and planned upgrades with planned load forecast. So while this planning process helps inform our capital plan about the types of investments that may be needed in the future, this does not particularly outline what our capital plan is. So there is a very big distinction between our local area planning process and then ultimately what projects Northwestern embarks upon or chooses to invest in.
You may, but just a clarifying question, was the court reporter given a copy of CED-R001? Would you mind doing that, Mr. Chandler? Thank you. And yes, you may approach. Mr. Chandler, would you mind giving a copy of this to the court reporter as well?
We were just going to use it as a cross-examination exhibit. We were going to move it as a. Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you.
All right, please proceed.
Mr. Pankratz, are you familiar with this document?
This appears to be a partial copy of a Transact presentation that Northwestern would have put out.
Okay, are you familiar with this document?
Yes, I'm aware of its contents.
In this September 22nd, 2022 presentation to Transact at page 28, you present a list of expected 2022 transmission project capital additions. That list includes 3.3 million for 100 kV H-frame upgrades on the Rainbow to Harleton to Billings transmission path. Is that correct?
Mr. Udo, I'm looking at the last page of the handout. However, I don't see the page number on this.
Okay. Well, I'll represent to you, subject to check, it's page 28.
Okay, subject to check.
Okay. But the question still stands, which is, does this identify a 100 kV H-frame upgrade at Rainbow, Harleton, and Billings at a cost of $3,948,950.38?
Yes, what's before me is projected net cost additions to Northwestern's system that it had planned by various asset locations. That does not necessarily specifically identify, though, what specific project that was.
Okay. My question is more general, though. Has the impact of those upgrades been reflected in the power flow data that Northwestern has used in this proceeding?
Yeah, I can't answer that directly. However, if my memory serves me correctly, the upgrades identified on this sheet of paper was primarily asset life type of additions that Northwestern did pole replacement on its transmission system.
So you don't know whether or not the impact of these upgrades was reflected in the power flow data that Northwestern used in this proceeding?
No, I can't answer that, whether there were actually any impacts to actually be reflected in a power flow model.
With respect to exhibit CED R001, can you please turn to page 23?
I'm sorry, Mr. Ruda, on page 23 on which document?
It's the document I handed to you earlier that was marked CED R001. It's the 2019 transmission plan.
What page number, please?
Page 23. Just distract. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Does it indicate in that local area transmission plan that there will be a tap, they're going to tap the Highwood switch yard, Judith Gap 230 and bring 230 kV into Benchland?
Point of clarification, though, it does not directly indicate that that is a plan of Northwestern's. It's true that the document that you're describing has those bullet points in there with what's been identified as major issues on Northwestern system. But again, this is not necessarily a capital plan.
No, I understand that. I'm just trying to figure out if it says this in the document. Is that, you understand?
Yes, it does.
Does it also say cut over Wyndham to Glengarry from 50 kilovolts to 100 kilovolts?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Does it also say rebuild Stanford, Glengarry, Benchland, and Harlowton substations?
Yes, it does.
And does it also say multiple contingencies can create overloads and or voltage excursions in the Lewistown division 50, 69, and 100 kV systems? The overloads cause numerous line trips with the potential of losing large industrial loads in the process. Voltages in the area can be improved by bringing in 230 kV into the Benchland or Stanford.
That's correct. That is indeed what it says. This also plays off of, I guess, reinforces, if you will, the points Mr. Cashel made earlier about the constrained area that we refer to as central Montana. It's true that it has been identified as a very constrained area.
In the study you completed here for the Wheatland project, did the power flow case include the 3 projects I just listed? A 230 kV tap between the Judith Gap 230 kV line and Benchland, the cut over of Wyndham to Glengarry from 50 to 100 kilovolts, and a rebuild of the Stanford, Glengarry, Benchland, and Harlowtown substations.
Yes, I believe it did. Those are listed contingent projects from senior Q projects in the Wheatland study. As I indicated earlier, when we look at the mitigation for central Montana, it's the focus here certainly has been on the section of 230, but identified in the Wheatland study are contingent upgrades as well that are expected to be there before Wheatland comes on. And that includes upgrades to the lower voltage 100 kV system.
So your testimony in this case is that all of these mitigations are included study you did for Wheatland in this case.
I can't speak specifically if each and every one of these line items was included, but in general, I can speak to that the contingent upgrades and mitigation identified for senior Q projects generally includes those items.
So when you receive an interconnection study like the one for Wheatland, do you go back and double check the accuracy of things that your engineers were doing for that study?
We generally always check ourselves for accuracy, yes.
Okay, but my question was more specific. The question was, do you do that?
I meet with my team and we do discuss these items, yes.
So did you review specifically the Wheatland project to ensure that all of these additions, mitigations to the transmission system were included in the Wheatland study?
Yes, I believe we reviewed and discussed these in general, yes.
More questions?
Thank you, Mr. Uda. Mr. Brown? Thank you. All right, commissioners. Do you have any questions for this witness, Vice President Fielder? That was a no, I believe. Commissioner O'Donnell?
Thank you, Mr. President. After all of that, with all the numbers and everything else like that, I feel intimidated from asking any question at all. But I did want to ask, so the 230 kV line can only have a capacity of 90 megawatts. And my understanding is not because of the line itself, but because of the other pieces of equipment on the system. And to use the entire 230 kV, there would have to be a system upgrade all the way up and down the line. Am I understanding that correctly?
Commissioner O'Donnell, I would say just your understanding, I think, is generally correct. Yes. What we've described as 90 megawatts of transfer capacity. That's transmission capacity that's gained by the addition of this one new transmission line segment. And the way I tend to describe that is that, the transmission system as a whole is made up of multiple different elements, hundreds and if not
Correct.
thousands of different individual elements. Each of them
Right.
have their own thermal rating.
Right.
And the transmission overall capacity or transfer capacity is not a product necessarily of any one of those certain line items. So perhaps an analogy I'd give you, Mr. O'Donnell, is that right here in Montana, the coal strip 500 kV transmission system. That 500 kV transmission system has been in place for 40 plus years, and that's made up of two parallel 500 kV transmission lines. Each one of those 500 kV lines has a thermal ampacity of approximately 3,500 megawatts each. So for a combined 7,000 megawatts of thermal ampacity, that's the rating of the line itself. But certainly we cannot transfer 7,000 megawatts of power out of Montana over those 500 kV lines. The limit is approximately 2,200 megawatts. And so I make that analogy to show the difference between transfer capacity, actual transfer capacity, and thermal ratings. They're not one and the same. We're also limited by various voltage stability limitations, other limitations on the system in terms of, again, when that contingency analysis happens, where does that power instantly try to go? And it will instantly try to flow it, or generally other connected systems, and potentially overload those.
Well, thank you for that. That was much more information than I was looking for than my question. But thank you. When you ask an engineer a question, you're going to get an engineer's answer. But I'm a philosopher. So I wanted to ask, the purpose of my question was that if somebody else were to subscribe to that line, capacity on that line, what they would have to do, they would have to upgrade the other, as you say, the thermal points on that line in order to be able to use that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, Commissioner O'Donnell, that is correct. There are, even within today, there are a number of junior Q projects that are also asking to interconnect to that area. And we have identified, I believe, estimates, nor in the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of upgrades potentially, but we're also talking about interconnection requests just in the central Montana area, somewhere in the 13 to 1,400 megawatts of requests that all want to connect to this one small line.
Thank you very much for that answer, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Commissioner Pinocci.
Thank you, Mr. President. Has Northwestern considered reconductoring the existing 230 kV line with a higher capacity advanced conductor?
Commissioner Pinocci, yes, indeed, we actually have considered that. And in this case, what advanced conductors would do, for one, is it would allow you to have that higher thermal rating of that individual line segment. Okay. So we could take that transmission line segment from 478 megawatt thermal ampacity to something higher. However, advanced conductors, won't do anything for us for the voltage instability issue that we have in the central Montana area. We certainly use advanced conductors where we can find the right application. And if we were to build new line segments, we would likely utilize those. But in this case, an advanced conductor would not help us with our voltage stability limitations and issues that are identified here.
We agree that an advanced conductor can cut line loss by a third. And if in fact that's true, wouldn't that help with that problem?
Commissioner Pinocci, respectfully, I don't know that it would help necessarily with that problem. Certainly, the right sized advanced conductor, if you will, is true. They can have lesser line losses as well, thermal losses. But I don't believe that it's accurate that it would be enough to solve the problem here.
A higher capacity line was used and the line loss was reduced. Would Northwest Energy customers benefit, say if we cut the line loss by a third?
Commissioner Pinocchio, I believe that generally speaking, yes, customers would benefit by less losses, yes.
If a higher capacity line was used, would that substantially reduce the cost of network upgrades, considering how no new right of way would need to be negotiated and no new structures or power poles would need to be installed? As I understand it, we can double the capacity with the same size line. The permitting process could take months, could cost, say, millions of dollars. If we could simply just replace the line under maintenance, bypassing the cost of restructuring the structures or the permitting process, do you think there'd be some benefits there?
Commissioner Pinocchio, it's true that there's certainly advantages of considering things like advanced conductors to where the opportunity exists to reconductor existing lines and utilize the existing facilities that we have and try to upgrade those. I believe that's certainly a true belief and a true thought. However, as we look to the central Montana area, again, the south of Great Falls area that the Wheatland project is requesting to interconnect, this is 1-230 line, as you heard Mr. Cashel describe this, 1-230 line, if you will, between Great Falls and Broadview, with lower voltage 100 kV lines in parallel to that. So what we've actually identified already as some of the contingent facility projects to Wheatland, as we described here today, we are anticipating that those will be advanced conductor type solutions. And so it would certainly get that benefit out of further upgrading the underlying system that's identified as contingent facilities. But the 230 line itself, just the notion of just reconductoring, if you will, this one single line and trying to get higher capacity out of it. There's a whole host of other issues that come into play. And quite frankly, just one of those is, in this case, is taking that line out of service for still potentially years at a time in order to do the work becomes very problematic.
Why wasn't a higher capacity advanced conductor identified in the system impact study as the most cost-effective way of integrating CED Wheatland into the system?
Commissioner Pinocchio, I would say the proposed solution was considered, although we didn't get specific to the types of material necessarily the conductor would be made of. As we described here today, and we attempt to describe in my testimony, is that regardless of the conductor one would use for this new line segment, advanced conductors in this case don't do anything to raise that transfer capacity beyond the 90 megawatts. So we could build this partial 230 line with an advanced conductor and come up with some higher value rating, but it's not going to increase that 90 megawatt transfer limit until we continue with additional mitigation beyond what's anticipated. Now, if one were to use, for example, a much higher rated advanced conductor from all the way from Great Falls to Broadview or something of that nature, that perhaps there'd be greater benefit.
So if we have, let's say, millions of dollars of savings by replacing the line under maintenance without doing a permitting process for new structures, we cut the line loss by a third, which studies tell me that we can pay for the power lines and a higher expense within 5 years. After that, the cost could be shared with the ratepayer. Wouldn't it be possible to cover the cost of replacing a high advanced conductor all the way to Great Falls and still be cheaper than trying to do it piecemeal? Say over 20 years?
Well, Commissioner Pinocchio, respectfully, while there's perhaps certainly merit in that thought, I think to this specific case, our issue here today is really about the allocation methodology that the Montana Supreme Court requested, not necessarily a re-engineering, if you will, of the solution.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. No more questions, and I'd like to be excused for another meeting.
I thank you, Commissioner Pinocchio. You are excused. Good luck. Commissioner Bukacek.
No questions.
All right. Mr. Pankratz. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I do have some questions for you. Hopefully not as long as Mr. Cashel. My first question is, when Northwestern is analyzing the results of a system impact study, can it distinguish new transmission capacity network upgrades from network upgrades that do not establish new capacity?
Yes, I believe that. Yeah, generally we can. Yes.
Please describe then how Northwestern Energy could distinguish the two types of network upgrades.
Well, specifically, even in the Con Edison case before us, there's, I believe, 3 separate projects that are before us in terms of the Wheatland project as one example. And then the other 2 projects are the Pondera and the Teton projects. In the Pondera and Teton projects, the network upgrades, the facilities that transmission facilities that are anticipated to be built in those cases are purely the components of the substation interconnection itself. So there are still network components of that associated with the substation, just connecting that project. Those 2 are network upgrades, but they don't add any capacity. We're not building any new lines. We're not upgrading really any of the system beyond just what it would take to connect those particular projects. In the Wheatland case, it involves, as described, the building of the new 230 kV line. And in those cases, when we're adding new facilities or upgrading those facilities, we can distinguish those as and make a determination of actual capacity gained.
Did you read Mr. Schiffman's testimony in this matter,
Yes, I did.
including his rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Can we get Mr. Schiffman's testimony?
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify his rebuttal testimony.
Yes. Page 4 of that specifically. Are you there, Mr. Pankratz?
Okay.
All right. You're familiar with that portion of Mr. Schiffman's rebuttal testimony where he discusses the investment in achieving incremental capacity.
Yes.
Okay. On page 4 of Mr. Schiffman's rebuttal testimony, Mr. Schiffman stated that investing more than 80 million to achieve 90 megawatts of incremental capacity is not cost effective. And he further stated that a lower voltage solution would likely be adequate to deliver Wheatland's 75 megawatts of capacity. And you're familiar with that testimony?
Yes, I am.
Okay, based on that testimony, is it Northwest Energy's position that lower voltage, that there are lower voltage solutions available for CED Wheatland's network upgrades?
President Brown, could you repeat that? I want to make sure I got that right.
Sure. So I guess the more direct question is, are there lower voltage solutions available for CED Wheatland's network upgrades according to Northwestern Energy? What's your position?
There is not in this case. And to expand on that further, the question of, well, can't you just build a 90 megawatt or a 75 megawatt connection solution for them? And my response to that in this case as well is, again, the developer chooses and requests the location on the transmission system that they want to connect. In this case, they asked for a 230 kV interconnection. And I described earlier that, again, we have to consider all of the senior queue projects as well that are attached to within Northwestern's queue. And in this case, the underlying 100 kV system, lower voltage system through the area, keep in mind, is already as part of all this contingent facilities is already upgraded. So we've already installed with this, if you will, senior to this project, the assumption, higher voltage systems, or higher capacity systems, And so as part of all that, as a connection to the 230 kV system, one might ask, well, just build another 100 kV line to Broadview then. But there are issues with that for us to do that. The reason we would connect or build another 230 kV line as opposed to another 100 kV line is, again, through our contingency analysis process, I generally speaking, that causes us issues if we're putting a high voltage line next to and parallel with a low voltage line. So that's why it's a 230 kV system. But I would also suggest to you that certainly Wheatland could again build their own lower voltage solution if they so choose to do, and build it to a stronger part of Northwestern system that wouldn't require upgrades.
So you were in the room, I believe, for Mr. Cashel's testimony, correct?
Yes, I was.
And I believe Mr. Cashel's testimony is that it's more expensive to develop a lower voltage line as opposed to a higher voltage line, correct?
I believe his testimony was that a higher voltage line is generally more expensive than
Okay.
a lower voltage line.
You're right. Yeah, I apologize for that. Okay. So why is that?
Larger systems, so 230 kV line, much larger facilities, a more difficult type of construction than generally lower voltage systems. So we look at, you can go all the way down to a distribution level and, smaller type systems. And then as we go up and incrementally in voltage, it becomes increasingly more expensive and more complex to do that.
So then that begs the question, did Northwestern Energy consider lower voltage solutions for CED Wheatland's interconnection? You may have answered that, but please expand on your answer.
We did consider it to the degree that lower voltage solutions would help solve the issue. But again, in this case, the existing underlying or lower voltage systems have already been upgraded. So we were not able to find a solution that would work, beyond that at the 230 kV interconnect. Perhaps if they would choose a different interconnection location, there may be some other solution that could work.
But I believe you testified that Northwest Energy doesn't choose the interconnection location?
Correct. The developer chooses and requests the interconnection location at what voltage level as well.
So I think Mr. Uda asked you a question about how much extra transmission capacity would remain for other generators to use, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So talk a little bit about this is more of a scenario, I suppose, but if Northwestern had installed a lower voltage or was going to pursue a lower voltage solution, how much extra transmission capacity would remain for other generators to use then?
President Brown, I said, attempt to answer it this way. I think absent new generation interconnections in the area, I'm not sure Northwestern would pursue any necessary upgrades to the system. And certainly we, as has come out here again today, through our local area planning processes, we identify this as a constrained area. We're aware of that, but it's become constrained with increased use of the system over time, with new generation that has come online, generations online today. All of that generation that's come online to date has been able to do that primarily without transmission upgrades. So that suggests that historically there's been some value of latent, if you will, latent capacity built into the transmission system. That latent capacity is now used up, which is perhaps why we're here today to some degree. So I'm not sure we would necessarily pursue major upgrades absent generation interconnect. But at some point, as Mr. Cashel described as well, we may be forced to upgrade the system due to degradation in reliability as load and system usage continues to grow.
All right, let's turn to your rebuttal testimony. You have that in front of me?
Yes, I do.
All right. Can you turn to pages 9 and 10 of that testimony?
Okay.
Okay. On pages 9 and 10 of your rebuttal testimony, you described the hiring of an independent third party to review Northwestern system impact study, correct?
Correct.
And you discuss the third party efforts to replicate and verify the results, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Can you summarize for the commission the nature of the disputed issues that the third party reviewed?
As I recall, there were a total of, I believe, 10 disputed items that Con Edison raised with Northwestern System Impact Study at the time. And while I can't cite all 10 of those off the top of my head without the document in front of me, there was a number of issues specifically, as I believe I describe in here as well in my rebuttal testimony, things like emergency ratings, for example. That was a disputed item. Northwestern's power flow modeling results similar to what you may be hearing today was a disputed item as well. As two examples.
I think you just testified that there were 10 items that were focused on, correct?
I believe there was a total of 10.
And so how many of the 10 issues, what would be the best way to characterize this, it was not found in Northwestern's favor?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to object to this line of questioning because that study is not in the record. Number two, there's a lot of more that goes into that study than just asking, how the arbitration came out on each of the different issues. Now, nobody's, at least so far, gotten it into the record. Nobody requested it to be in the record. So you're asking a question about something that's not in the record.
I appreciate that, Mr. Uda. Your objection is noted. I'm going to overrule that at this time. So go ahead and answer the question. Do you know?
I believe that 9 of the 10 disputed items were in Northwestern's favor. There was one item that the third party agreed that Northwestern made an error, and as such, we decided to restudy that, complete a restudy of that effort. To expand on that, and I believe that it's actually in my rebuttal testimony in terms of some of the details. The basic item was Northwestern made an assumption about a greater amount of south of Great Falls transfer capacity than what was actually available, and so we selected to restudy that.
Was that the path transfer level?
Yes, it was.
Please discuss the import of that finding that the south of Great Falls path transfer level exceeded reliable opening conditions. And I will note your continuing objection, Mr. Rudin.
That's all I was going to say, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Well, I think the importance of that is Northwestern made in its initial study work, as the arbitrator determined, was that we were using a higher transfer level than we should have been reliably. And in transmission planning speak, we referred to that as we were actually pushing it too hard in terms of the amount of generation that could be added to the system before mitigation was actually necessary. So I think that was probably the important distinction in there is that we were allowing more transmission service commitments than we reliably should have been. So we were able to reduce that with the restudy to more of a reliable value.
All right, I'm going to take you back to Mr. Schiffman's rebuttal testimony. Page 4 and 5 of that. Are you there?
Yes.
On pages 4 and 5 of Mr. Schiffman's rebuttal testimony, Mr. Schiffman testifies that Northwestern did not employ redispatch or remediation actions that would alleviate the transmission overloads created by its modeling assumptions, correct?
Yes, I believe that's generally what he asserts.
Well, the obvious question then is, do you agree with his characterization?
No, I do not, President Brown. Redispatch of generation within generation interconnection study work is not necessarily part of what Northwestern does. I think part of all of this, what Mr. Schiffman seems to misplace, is the two different types of transmission planning type studies that are actually done. There's study work that's done similar to our local area planning efforts, just looking at the reliable operation of our existing system. And then there's generation interconnection study work that's done as a separate part of our tariff with separate requirements. And specifically within generation interconnection study work, the reason that we don't dispatch, or I should say redispatch, existing generation in a local area is we are purposely trying to stress the system. And I use that terminology because that's a definition that's actually within our generation interconnection procedures, is to stress that system in that local area. And that's a very important point, that we do those types of things so that as generation gets built out onto the system, we're the transmission provider or the operator, as Northwestern in this case, we can operate the system reliably under all known various conditions and emergency situations and various generation levels. It's critical that we're able to do that.
All right, so then elucidating on some terms you used in your answer right there. Can you define for the commission what are redispatch and remediation actions generally?
Well, generally speaking, a redispatch of generation would be something that may occur in in real-time transmission planning. So the day-to-day operations of the transmission system. As we sit here today, we have transmission operators that are operating the system in real time. And as various disturbances, issues happen on a line, perhaps the line goes out of service for a variety of reasons or whether something comes through. The transmission operator's role is to keep that system in balance, constant balance between load and generation without overloading and utilizing the existing transmission system that's there to feed that system. So as part of all of that, in real-time operations, that they oftentimes have to redispatch generation so that the system can continue to operate reliably and maintain load and generation balance. A remediation action would be, again, something that would occur in real time that our operators perhaps would have to do to mitigate for some event. So they may have to make a redispatch of generation in the real time or the 5 minute or even day ahead type of system.
And along that line, redispatch and remediation will have an impact on Northwestern's transmission operations generally and cost, correct?
Yes, they certainly can. Yes.
Explain how.
President Brown, that actually may be a question that may be better directed at Mr. Schmidt.
Okay. Staying with Mr. Schiffman's rebuttal testimony, which I believe you have in front of you, page 9.
Okay.
Okay. On page 9, Mr. Schiffman's testimony, he provides testimony about modeling a reduction in generation at coal strip units 3 and 4 to keep the system in balance, correct?
So I believe that's what he asserts, along with a few other various dispatch scenarios.
All right, you're familiar with this testimony?
Yes.
Please feel free to comment on Mr. Schiffman's testimony, but specifically how you interpret this action and what this might mean for Northwestern's operations and cost.
President Brown, I believe Mr. Schiffman's analysis that he presents here is, again, it's a case of maybe misplacing the different types of transmission analysis that can be done. I mean, as I view his analysis here, he's confusing the generation interconnection project with real-time transmission operations, transmission planning studies. And in a real-time operations scenario, again, as I described earlier, for various types of contingencies or losses of pieces of equipment, et cetera, there's redispatching of generation and things that need to occur, and making different assumptions about different generation values on various different generators is really kind of irrelevant, quite frankly, to the case at hand or generation interconnection procedures, because again, what we're trying to do is make sure that we can reliably operate the system while including that project and providing the bare minimum amount of mitigation that's necessary to bring that project online and operate the system reliably. So I'm not sure I can opine on the cost impacts, though, sir.
Very good. Please explain to the commission how Northwestern Energy develops and designs its system impact study.
President Brown, without trying to give too much of an engineer's answer again, in terms of the technicality of a system impact study. These are, system impact studies are a mathematical model of the existing transmission system with all the various resources and the loads that are connected on the system. And it's a series of engineering analysis that occurs to ultimately make that determination based on sound engineering processes and practices that are very well defined, quite frankly, for us by NERC and WEC and other entities that have oversight over Northwestern's transmission system. So while it's, as a transmission provider and a planner, our engineers perform that work, but it is all under the I guess kind of careful study work and procedures that are outlined for us by NERC and WEC.
So help me understand. So is the system impact study subject to regulatory review by NERC and WEC? And what I mean by that is, do you have to gain approval from those regulatory agencies?
Not direct oversight, President Brown, but the study procedures that Northwestern conducts these under is defined within our OAT and within our tariff. So to that degree, there is some level of oversight.
It's not necessarily subject to some kind of approval
No.
process.
It is not.
Thank you for indulging my questions. Mr. Hamilton, do you have some questions?
Mr. President, just a few. Mr. Pankratz, earlier in your testimony, you were asked about a cluster study. Could you describe for me what a cluster study is?
Mr. Hamilton, a cluster study is a procedure where one would take a number of different generation interconnects from all the multiple different parties and make one study of all those under one different study. Northwestern does not perform that level of study work today. We perform that on an individual project by project basis. But the cluster process would, essentially put them all into one study and study all the impacts of all the projects all at one time.
Is it your understanding that Northwestern would be prohibited from conducting a cluster study under its current tariffs?
I'm not aware that would be prohibited, but that may be a question better directed to Ms. Mueller, who may know more of the details.
All right, moving on. I believe in response to questions from President Brown, you mentioned that it would be a problem for Northwestern to have two different parallel lines of different voltage ratings. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mr. Hamilton, what I was referring to, not necessarily a problem for Northwestern, but it becomes a technical reliability challenge operating the system that way, operating a system with two separate voltages.
Is it your testimony that Wheatland could build a line at a lower voltage parallel to Northwestern's that interconnects with Northwestern's system at a stronger point?
Mr. Hamilton, what I was describing, it was, just as an example, in lieu of requesting interconnection at the location that Wheatland did, I just indicated that yes, they could build their own generation lead line to a different location.
If Wheatland can do it, why can't Northwestern?
Mr. Hamilton, so what we're referring to here, maybe the difference between third party owned or a developer owned generation lead line and a transmission network component. And in this case, what has been requested is a connection to Northwestern's transmission system in the central Montana area. And in order to connect that, what Northwestern is, required to do is do all the study work to make that determination of what kind of upgrades are necessary. That real distinction then would be that generator lead line. I referred to a generator lead line, that's just a direct connection, if you will, call it an extension cord from the generator to the point that it connects to the system. And further upon that, I mean, that is the developer's responsibility to build their own generator lead line. So that's typically not something Northwestern would do.
All right. One last question for you, Mr. Pankratz. You've testified, if I understand correctly, that there is a difference between the type of local area transmission planning Northwestern does and the type of transmission study work that it does to interconnect a new generator. That's correct?
That's correct.
So when you identify needs in your local area transmission plan, are those intended to allow additional generator interconnection?
Mr. Hamilton, no, they are not. Specifically, what we include in our local area planning effort is our load forecasts in a 5, 10, and 15-year out type of a look. And we include known generators that are under construction. So we can't plan for necessarily all the generation that's in Northwestern's interconnection queue within our local area plan. Today, we have somewhere north of 11,000 megawatts of generation that is asking to connect to Northwestern system. I believe there's approximately 13 to 1,400 megawatts of just QF generation that wants to interconnect to Northwestern system, all to serve Northwestern's approximate 1,200 megawatts of load. And in order to do that, if we were to plan all of the transmission to do that and put that into our local area plan, not sure I could fathom how large that would actually be and the types of upgrades that would be identified throughout all that.
All right, thank you. Nothing further.
Question for the parties. We've been at it for about an hour and 49 minutes. You inclined to take a 10-minute break? Okay. Time is now 2:49 p.m. We will take a 10-minute break, come back at 3 o'clock and resume questioning of this witness. We will go off the record.
Yes, I am.
All right, the time is now 3:01 PM. We are back on the record. Where we left off was with cross-examination of Mr. Pancratz, Mr. Uda.
I just have a couple of questions for Mr. Pancratz. The chairman asked you a question about page 9 of Mr. Schiffman's testimony. Do you recall those questions?
In general, yes.
Okay. And he asked you specifically about the statement that by increasing injections at or near Wheatland Wind and reducing generation at Colstrip, this approach creates a condition where incremental energy injections are likely to flow towards the Broadview and Colstrip areas when injections are increased in the vicinity of Wheatland Wind Project. Just as a matter of general studying, is this statement correct? If you were to do that, would that be the result?
Sir, I don't know that I can answer that question directly.
Okay. And when Chairman Brown asked you about reducing generation at Colstrip, you understood the context of what Mr. Schiffman was doing was trying to replicate your power flow study, correct?
Mr. Uda, respectfully, I'm not sure I do know exactly what Mr. Schiffman was doing within his study work.
Okay, well, let me just read to you what he said. He said, in completing the power flow modeling, this is on page 9, I first replicated the case that Northwestern completed in evaluating Wheatland's wind interconnection request under restudy. That's what he said, right?
That's what he says.
Okay, do you have any basis to disagree with that statement?
Well, perhaps actually I do, Mr. Uda, because what I'm unaware of just by reading Mr. Schiffman's testimony is that I don't know the full level of analysis that he performed. Did he perform northbound and southbound, for example, transmission studies that would replicate the actual transmission commitment levels that Northwestern has on the system? I'm unaware of that just by reading this testimony.
Right, but Northwestern had every opportunity, several rounds of discovery. If it wanted an answer to that question, it could have posed those questions, correct?
I'm unaware whether we needed an answer to that.
Okay, so instead, you would rather disregard his statement about what he was doing, raise your own hypothetical doubts about what he was doing. Is that correct?
Objection argumentative.
It is argumentative. I will withdraw the question. Mr. Pancratz, sitting here right now, are you calling Mr. Schiffman a liar?
No, I did not say that.
Okay. Do you doubt that he made his best effort to replicate the load flow studies?
What I have my doubts about is I'm unaware of the level of detail that he went into to replicate the planning model.
Well, let me refresh your recollection, Mr. Pancratz, because this afternoon I went through a whole detailed series of questions where he was checking your math between the restudy and the study that you're presenting in this case, and he found discrepancies, correct?
Are you referring to the host of numbers we spoke about earlier?
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so is that somebody who's not detailed?
Well, again, Mr. Reed, I can't, I don't know what Mr. Schiffman specifically conducted, how he performed that particular level of study work. But however, to the earlier line of questioning, and during break, one of my planning engineers was able to help educate me as well in terms of the discretion about the different numbers that we talked about here earlier. Those are differences between northbound and southbound transmission modeling cases, and there are going to be some level of differences between one study to the other.
Right, but that is exactly what redispatch is, isn't it? You're doing this modeling?
Redispatch, again, I believe that we're misplacing the terms between generation interconnection study work and transmission planning study work that occurs outside of the generation purview. As part of generation interconnection study work, generally the amount of redispatch is used to help match up and understand the level of transmission commitments that are there today on the system.
Right. But when you do your load flow study, it has to balance. Right?
Yes, systems have to balance between resource and load.
Right. So if you're going to balance it, something has to be changed, correct?
Correct, and that can be the direction of power flow, which Northwestern has different levels of commitments on its system in terms of a commitment being contracts for the use of the transmission system. That can be different in a one direction or the other.
But you are changing generation projects that you don't own. That wasn't a decision to change something that was a Northwestern resource. You were changing resources all over the state of Montana and all the way over into the state of Washington. Is that right?
Well, Mr. Root, again, I think that that's mischaracterizing the study process in terms of the tools and the analysis that's done.
Okay, well, let me ask you this question. Without reducing the generation at Grand Coulee, sorry. Would your load flow study have balanced? You'd be 80 megawatts over, wouldn't you?
Perhaps, well, I can't speculate on that. It could have been another generator that could be dispatched in another manner.
Okay, but we do know that in the load flow study, Grand Coulee was reduced 80 megawatts. And I'm saying if you hadn't reduced it 80 megawatts, your load flow study wouldn't have balanced, would it?
Well, again, Mr. Ruda, the reason that we would dispatch, as you described, Grand Coulee in a model, and the differences between the two models that you described, again, is the difference between planning engineers attempting to model and replicate the system under different scenarios, and a different direction of transmission flow scenario from, in this case, north to south or south to north are different. And you're going to, as a planning engineer, one must make different assumptions to change those generation values to, again, help replicate those flows and commitments that occur on the system.
I don't think we're communicating very well. I want you to know that I have the highest respect for your engineers and the work that you've done. I just need a simple answer to a simple question. Okay, that question is this. Grand Coulee, if you don't reduce that generation by 80 megawatts, your load flow study would not have balanced as it currently exists, not with any other assumptions. Is that correct?
In the particular study that you're defining, I believe that that's correct, that the planning engineer needed to make an assumption about that value to, again, try to match up that commitment level, in particularly in the south of Great Falls area. We're not concerned in this case about transmission, the level of generation, or the perhaps even transmission commitments. We're not studying in a remote area beyond, in this case, beyond the south of Great Falls area. So again, some of those, although a planning engineer will make these modeling assumptions and these changes very remote to the system, as you described, northern state of Washington versus south of Great Falls. But again, we're making those to match up to some level of flow. And I can't describe to you the amount of commitments on the existing south of Great Falls path, but it's in the order of several hundred megawatts.
I understand your answer, but I want to make sure that we're all clear. If Grand Coulee is operating at the previous level, not reduced by 80 megawatts, your load flow study would not have balanced. That's correct, right?
Objection asked and answered.
I'm going to sustain that.
That's okay.
I'm confident he answered that question, Mr.
Fair enough. All right, one more question. This is a Does FERC require you to have a transmission planning process?
Yes, I believe so. Local area planning is mentioned in the need for that, I believe, is for quarter 890, I believe.
So those documents do have meaning.
Certainly.
Okay, if you didn't comply with them, you could get in trouble with FERC, correct?
That's probably correct. Yes.
That's all the questions I have.
Thank you, Mr. Urban. Mr. Brown? No questions. Thank you. All right, Ms. Norcott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pankratz, I know you just discussed this to a large degree with Mr. Uda about the differences between the generation values, that whole litany of differences that math-wise he went through with you. Those differences, were those appropriate?
Yes, I believe they were appropriate.
And why was that?
As I attempted to describe with Mr. Uda, in order to conduct this level of transmission analysis, planning engineers in this case, though, again, we'll use what we referred to in this case as a northbound case. We're matching up the actual level of commitments and flows and the amount of contracted capacity that's already used up on the south of Great Falls area. And that's a different value for us in terms of that contracted value in a northbound case and a different value in a southbound case. So as part of all of that, what a transmission planning engineer is attempting to model is to model that system to reach that whatever that contracted value is. And in order to do that in a modeling function, they'll increase or decrease generation values, i.e. redispatch those values. But we do that in a manner that doesn't affect the local area, if you will, that we're attempting to study. So regardless of what's going on at Grand Coulee Dam, it doesn't affect the south of Great Falls path.
So Mr. Uda, going to the Grand Coulee modification that was discussed at length, did Northwestern, I guess the assumption was made that the 90 megawatt reduction at Grand Coulee somehow then translated into the 90 megawatts of additional added capacity. Is that a correct assumption?
No, it is not. I mean, it's a coincident value that the numbers seem to be the same 90 megawatts, but they're not. The value that was used in the planning study to, again, redispatch up or down a remote generator to achieve that level of contract transmission commitment is irrelevant or maybe coincidental to the fact that it's about 90 megawatts of transmission capacity, or excuse me, is 90 megawatts of transmission capacity created by the addition of the new 230 line.
Mr. Uda asked you a line of questionings that, it's just about the math. Do you recall those? And that if you lower the denominator, it lowers the amount that Wheatland would be or Con Ed would be responsible for. Do you recall those questions?
Yes, I do.
I guess, first of all, did Northwestern look at how much additional capacity would be added to the system if it was to build the full 230 kV line from Great Falls to Broadview?
No, we did not.
And how much would it have cost for Northwestern to build that full transmission line?
Well, as part of not analyzing, we did not estimate what it would cost to build that full line. However, in some of the prior study work, it was estimated. And I believe that at the time, again, we're going back now approximately 3 or 4 years now. At the time, a full 230 line from Great Falls to Broadview was estimated, I believe, in the subject to check in the $270 million range.
Would that have been a higher cost than the costs that were found in the study?
Yes, certainly. And I think to the point, and the question about is just about the math. It's the analogy may certainly be valid, but that you're going to, that denominator is also going to be a much higher cost value. So, and additionally, I mean, there could be other mitigation that may be necessary too. I cannot say what that is, but I don't believe that it's fair to say that necessarily, even that allocation methodology, that Wheatland's true cost would be less. I don't know that as a fact.
Do you recall a line of questioning about whether or not the Yellowstone County Generating Station was included in the Wheatland study?
Yes, I do.
Generally speaking, if a generation project has a granted transmission service request, would it be appropriate to include it in a generation interconnection study?
Yes, it would be.
Do you recall if Yellowstone County Generating Station has been granted transmission service?
Yes, I believe that Yellowstone County Generation has been granted service, and to that point, and my earlier response to that, what I thought Mr. Uda was asking was, did we study that within the LGIA, or excuse me, within the generation interconnection process itself? And no, we did not. The Yellowstone County Generation project was included in the Wheatland because it had transmission service. So that's a transmission commitment now that's there. That's why it was included.
Mr. Uda was also asking you about Northwestern's assumption to incrementally increase the transmission capacity, or the generation, 5 megawatts, whereas it sounds like Mr. Schiffman did 50 megawatts. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
And do you recall that he asked you, or he submitted to you, that Mr. Schiffman's testimony indicated that there was no overloads until about 500 megawatts? Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Do you agree with Mr. Schiffman's analysis that no overloads until, or there is no overloads until approximately 500 or so megawatts?
No, I do not.
Can you please explain why?
Well, as I described earlier, I cannot fully describe exactly, the process that Mr. Schiffman used as part of his overall analysis. What I can deduce from, the available information I have and looking at his testimony is he made a number of different assumptions, as transmission planning engineers do, about generation dispatch values, et cetera, along with what appears to be different generation injection points at not only Wheatland, but at the Judith Gap area. And I cannot make a determination how to replicate his study work, but I do not agree that there's not overloads until 550 megawatts. There's just, even within the queue alone, that with Wheatland and queue included, there's somewhere north of 500 megawatts, I believe, senior to Wheatland alone in the south of Great Falls path, including a number of existing transmission commitments.
Mr. Pankratz, do you also recall discussing what has been marked and moved into the record as exhibit CED R001, the local area transmission from January 1st of 2018 to December 31st of 2019?
Yes.
And Mr. Uda was asking you about some specific mitigation or plans mitigation for the Judith Gap 100 kV. I guess, would it be a transformer?
It was the transformer, I believe, yes.
Do you know whether or not Northwestern rebuilt the Judith Gap transformer that was discussed in that local area plan?
It is not rebuilt today. However, it is included in some of the contingent analysis to the senior Q projects. That upgrade is included in that.
So can you describe for the commission what a contingent facility is?
So a contingent facility is facilities or upgrades that are necessary contingent upon the interconnection of this project. So Again, we have a number of different senior queue projects that are out there, as I described earlier. And within many of those projects, similar network upgrades are identified in those. And so we make that assumption that those senior queue projects are online ahead of Wheatland case, and the network upgrades that are described for those senior queue projects become the contingent projects for the junior queue project. So in this case, some of these earlier identified upgrades are contingent for Wheatland.
So just to be clear, Mr. Pankratz, there are contingent facilities identified in the Wheatland interconnection studies, correct?
Correct.
Is Northwestern asking that Wheatland pay for those contingent facilities?
I believe that is not a part of the discussion here today in terms of the cost that's been described here today. But as part of the, I believe, perhaps the LGIA for Wheatland would identify those contingent facilities as well.
Is there a difference between long-term planning and short-term operation of the system?
Yes, there is.
Can you please describe that for the commission?
Certainly. So in my testimony, I described what we refer to as real-time operations or real-time planning, or the operations horizon. And then there's the long-term horizon. So the day-to-day operation of the transmission system, our operators that are operating that system virtually today, they're operating in real time today. They're operating within what's described as that operations horizon. So they're constantly balancing the system on a moment by moment basis with loads and generation, depending on the transmission system operating conditions, et cetera. So they operate that in order to maintain reliability and to serve customers and maintain load and certain criteria that they have to do. Transmission planners, on the other hand, operate in what we refer to as the long-term planning horizon. So they're planning for the future. They're looking out at least 1 year plus, often described as 1 to 2 year plus, but in 5, 10, 15 year kind of cycles to plan to operate that system now and well into the future. And that's where generation interconnection study work is also performed under that long-term transmission planning horizon. And I'd say the important distinction there is that long-term planning is conducted so that as the loads continue to grow, the use of the system continues to grow, we know that we can operate the system reliably into the future, whatever that horizon looks like. Conversely, again, the operations of the real-time horizon is the system that they're operating today. And so planners are planning for the future. Operators are just operating what's given to them today.
Thank you. Mr. Pankratz, do you recall discussing some pages from a PowerPoint presentation given at a September 28th, 2022 Transact meeting?
Yes, I do.
And if you could turn to the last page of that particular handout. Mr. Uda had asked you specifically about $3.9 million approximately to do some work related to 100 kV H-frame Rainbow Harlowtown Billings. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
These were projected additions in 22, correct?
That's correct.
Do you know whether or not these additions were in fact completed in 22?
I believe that the additions were completed. However, I don't have the information in front of me in terms of what the actual cost was. That information will become available to our customers here within, I believe, the second quarter here with Transact.
Would the upgrades that are identified this line item, if you know, would those have somehow benefited the Wheatland interconnection?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Commissioner Panochi was asking you about advanced conductors and the comment about cost effectiveness. In your opinion, are advanced conductors a cost effective solution?
I think advanced conductors are a cost-effective solution for the right application. And there are applications on Northwestern system where we use advanced conductors today, and I expect we will continue to do so in the future. But those situations are generally these areas, existing transmission lines in urban areas perhaps, or areas that would benefit by the rebuild, if you will, just adding more capacity to that one single transmission line element. And doing so, there's a lot of other criteria that goes into that in terms of just more than just the capacity addition, but there's, various engineering construction considerations that go into that too. So that, as Mr. Panochi, I think, described as well, less loss. We don't have to perhaps change out poles and different things when we select the right conductor. So there are good applications for that. However, in the Wheatland case, using advanced conductor, for example, as a solution to perhaps rebuild a segment of the 230 line in the Great Falls or Judith Gap areas would not provide any more capacity to us. It would create a line with more thermal capability, perhaps, but it wouldn't necessarily add more transmission capacity to that area until we realize additional upgrades someplace else.
And Mr. Pankratz, I guess to be clear in that it would add additional thermal rating to the existing 200 kV line, correct?
Correct.
Which doesn't add additional transmission capacity to Northwestern system.
Correct.
President Brown was asking you about specific or explicit authorization from the WEC or NERC. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you know whether or not Northwestern is audited by WEC?
Yes, Northwestern is audited by both WEC and NERC on periodic basis. I believe 2 or 3 year cycle, I believe.
And last line of questioning, the chairman, Mr. President, also asked you about the third-party evaluators' decision and the one item that the independent third party found against Northwestern. And I believe you had testified that.
I'm going to object to this line of questioning. I think I've already objected to it. I don't think it's permissible to cross-examine someone on a docket that's not in the record.
Objection noted. Please proceed.
So again, I believe you testified that what Mr. Angel or the third party decision maker was saying in that case was Northwestern pushed its system too much and you had agreed. So you restudied. Was that your testimony?
That's correct.
Do you believe that Northwestern's study work in this case to determine the 90 megawatts of additional usable and reliable transmission capacity appropriately pushed Northwestern's system?
Relative to the current restudy in terms of how did we conduct it correctly to determine the 90 megawatts? Yes, I believe we did.
So you didn't over push the system?
We did not.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Okay. Do you temporarily excuse this witness?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Pankratz. I'd like to call your next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Northwestern calls Autumn Mueller.
Ms. Mueller, please come forward. Ms. Mueller, I believe that you were in the room when we did the mass swearing, as I like to refer to it as.
Correct, yes.
All right, thank you.
Ms. Mueller, would you please state your name, spelling your last name, business address?
Yes, my name is Autumn Muller, Mulleller. My business address is 11 East Park Street in Butte, Montana, 59701.
And by whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
Would you please provide the commission with your title at Northwestern Energy?
Yes, I'm the supervisor of generation and transmission interconnection.
Ms. Mueller, did you submit pre-filed direct testimony in this docket?
I did.
And placed before you is a document that has been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit NWER 5. If you would take a moment to review that document and indicate when you are finished.
Okay.
Is Exhibit NWER 5 a true and correct copy of your pre-filed direct testimony?
It is.
And if I were to ask you here today under oath the same questions that are set forth in that exhibit, would your answers be the same except for any changes or modifications?
They would.
And do you have any corrections or modifications that you need to make to this exhibit?
I do not.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I move for the admission of Exhibit NWER 5.
Mr. Uda,
No objection.
Mr. Brown. All right, seeing no objection, NWER 5 is admitted.
Thank you. With that, Ms. Mueller is available for questioning and cross-examination.
Mr. Uda,
No questions.
Mr. Brown. All right, Vice President Fielder.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do have a few questions for Ms. Mueller. Ms. Mueller, I am going to ask you a little bit about AMM-1. This is Northwestern Energy's QF cost allocation methodology.
Okay.
In this, on page 1, Northwest of this document, it explains that the cost of contingent facilities will not be allocated.
Correct.
Would you please define contingent facilities?
Yes, so contingent facilities are projects that were identified for earlier generator interconnection requests. And in order for the Wheatland project to interconnect, assuming that the projects interconnect in order of queue position, those contingent facilities would be required before Wheatland could interconnect. So they would be funded by an earlier queued project, and then Wheatland would need them in order to interconnect as well.
Thank you. Is that term contingent facilities, is that defined in the LGIA?
It's for sure in the LGIP. I'm not positive. I don't believe it's actually in the LGIA itself, but it is in the LGIP.
When Northwestern is analyzing the results of a system impact study, can it distinguish new transmission capacity network upgrades from network upgrades that do not establish new capacity?
Yes, it can.
Would you please describe how Northwestern distinguishes the two types of network upgrades?
Sure. So an interconnection customer requests interconnection. And maybe the easiest way to explain the two might be the ERIS and NRIS studies that are performed under our tariff. So under the FERC interconnection process, can you hear me okay? Okay. Under the FERC interconnection process, there's an ERIS study which identifies the interconnection point. The planning model basically makes room for the generator to interconnect at the specific point, and we identify what costs are necessary at that point of interconnection. So other generation on the system would be backed down in that model to make room so that we could identify what costs are necessary to interconnect that project just specific to that location. So basically it's interconnection costs only. Those upgrades that we identified there would be like a substation cost. So they don't create transmission capacity. It's not like a transmission line upgrade. It is basically just an interconnection point. Under an NRIS interconnection, the planning model, the other generators in the area are dispatched up. The output of the generation is modeled into the system. So we will take a look to see what upgrades are required as the generation moves out onto the system and whatever overloads are required. In this case, and I don't know if, I apologize. I'm going to look at my testimony for just one moment. In the case of the Wheatland project, the interconnection costs that were identified in the study were a total of 85 million overall. Of the 85 million, the substation itself accounted for approximately $9 million. So to interconnect the project physically to the system, we needed $9 million worth of upgrades. The additional upgrades were the transmission lines that had to be upgraded in the area and enabled to support the NRIS interconnection, which would allow that generation to serve load in that area. So basically, the output of the generation to be able to move onto the system to serve local load in that area. In this case, it was approximately $76 million worth of transmission line upgrades that were necessary to support that. So the differentiation between those two pieces are the interconnection point, the physical point where the system is connected to Northwestern's transmission system, and the lines that are necessary to move that generation to serve that load as a network resource interconnection service.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to AMM1 for a minute. Under the heading of methodology, Northwestern states that the methodology will apply to network upgrades that create new transmission capacity that add benefits for the QF and other customers. Are you with me on that? This is basically the first sentence under the methodology paragraph on page 1.
Okay, yes.
Okay. Want to take a minute to read that?
Sure. Okay.
Does Northwestern's methodology account for any benefits other than increased transmission capacity?
The methodology was developed specifically for transmission capacity, so I would say no. The upgrades could have additional benefits, but what we focused on for purposes of this methodology was specific to capacity.
Has the boat tariff queue changed with respect to the cost responsibility of Wheatland Wind for Northwestern's proposed new transmission capacity upgrades since you filed testimony in this proceeding?
Could you ask that again? I'm sorry.
Yes. Has the open access transmission or OAT queue changed with respect to the cost responsibility of Wheatland Wind for Northwestern's proposed new transmission capacity upgrades since you filed testimony in this proceeding?
So are you saying, are there different projects in the interconnection queue since this?
Has the queue changed?
There have been probably later queued projects, yes. So at the bottom of the queue, we probably do have some newer interconnection requests since this request was made, yes.
Do you have any further elaboration on that subject and how the queue has changed?
We do have a couple of new generator interconnection requests that are in our queue since I sponsored this testimony. I looked this morning, I think in 2023, we've had 4 new requests in our queue this year so far.
How would those changes affect Northwestern's proposed cost allocation to Wheatland for the new transmission capacity upgrades and all directly assigned costs?
I don't necessarily know that they would. It would just depend on the area for interconnection requests and also the type of customer. In our cost allocation methodology that we've proposed, we basically have to kind of carve out a process for QFs as opposed to for customers. Under the FERC rules, we cannot allocate costs among customers. So we identify contingent facilities. And so project A may make certain upgrades. Project B might need them, but they don't pay for them. They only pay for their own upgrades. And so there's not a sharing between them. With our proposed cost allocation methodology that we put together, we did have to establish a separate process for QFs. So if a project behind Wheatland was a QF, like in this instance where we have a 83%, 17% allocation, the 83% would be funded by Wheatland. And if a QF project comes in behind it and actually benefits from it, then we believe that there could be a cost sharing of that additional 17% to the next QF project. But if it's a FERC project under the FERC rules, contingent facilities are not shared between projects, so we would not. So it really would just depend on what type of customer was next.
So when would CED know its actual allocation of new transmission capacity upgrade costs?
So where CED is at in our queue, I believe there's just one, well, there are two projects that are ahead of them. One's an ERIS project, so it would not impact them. The only other project that is ahead of them is a 220 megawatt project. It's combined two queue positions, project 335 and 347. If that project were to withdraw, then that could change the study results and study findings for Wheatland, and they could have to be restudied. Assuming that they move forward, then the costs that we've currently identified for Wheatland are what are identified in our current study work, and that's what their cost obligation would be. As far as the additional 17%, until somebody builds behind them, we don't know. I mean, we wouldn't know if it's a FERC customer versus a QF, whoever goes next. So that 17% could be, in question until the next project behind them goes. And otherwise, those costs, if it's a FERC project that's behind them, then that additional 17% of those costs would, go to our ratepayers. They wouldn't be funded by another generator interconnection request.
You pulled a lot of information out of your head. I commend you for that. I'd like to get, I know that you've probably discussed this throughout these last couple of answers, but could you just clearly for me describe the process, including expected time increments that would result in a final assessment of new transmission capacity upgrade costs?
Will you ask that again, please?
Just could you please describe the process, including the expected time increments that would result in a final assessment of NTC upgrade costs?
So for right now, based on what we know, the project that is ahead of Wheatland is moving forward. So our assumption as of now is that the costs associated with the study work that's been provided to Wheatland are correct and accurate. Again, if that project does choose to withdraw from our queue and a restudy is necessary, that can happen actually at any time. Under the FERC rules, interconnection customers actually have a 3-year window. They can suspend their project for 3 years and come out of suspension and then start into construction. So the FERC interconnection rules do give customers a lot of flexibility to kind of slow down things in their project, work through issues if they have a permitting issue or certain problems. So, we'll see customers in our queue. I mean, we have a project that's been in our queue since, 2007, and it went through, used the 3 years, withdrew and resubmitted in the same location, and it's there again and used the 3 years again. So the interconnection world is very uncertain because there is so much flexibility for time. But again, there's only one project ahead of this project that could impact them. So as of right now, what we know is the costs that we've provided to them. And one additional thing is under the tariff, there is opportunity for an optional study. So like, for example, Wheatland could come to us and say, what happens to our project if this project withdraws? And then we would run a study and we could give them those costs and provide that information to them ahead of time if they wanted to know that. So there is some, information that's available if they want to seek that out. Otherwise, we just have to assume everybody's moving forward.
Okay, so I'm really not hearing that there is an expected time increment or expected time increments. Is that what you're saying? There's just a lot of different factors and you don't have an expected time increment, or do you have a sense for what the expected time increment is on when that final assessment of NTC upgrade cost could be determined?
I would say up to 3 years, just because the customer ahead of them has the right to kind of delay their project that long. After that, they either have to move forward or withdraw. So I would say they have probably a 3-year window for sure.
Thank you. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice President Fielder. Commissioner O'Donnell.
No questions, Mr. President. Thank you.
All right. Commissioner Bukacek, any questions?
No questions.
All right. I don't have any questions. Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple to clarify. Ms. Mueller, you in response to one of Vice President Fielder's questions said that Northwestern hasn't, in this proposed cost allocation methodology, accounted for benefits other than the capacity provided by the network upgrades. I'm curious, how would Northwestern account for those benefits beyond the capacity provided by network upgrades?
That I don't know. I mean, I don't know what would be measurable there. I mean, what we did is we went with capacity because it was something that we could determine how many megawatts can we add at this location before we start to see other issues on our system that's measurable. We have projects that are behind this project in our queue. When we ran their studies for the following 2 projects, I believe they're each 200 megawatts. We saw significant overload. So the next 200 megawatt project behind them is project 420 in our queue. That's a 200 megawatt project and that had $42 million worth of network upgrades, plus all the contingent facilities. So the Wheatland project upgrades and the projects earlier, in addition, 42 million more. We then have project 422 in our queue, which is behind that. And for another 200 megawatts in that same area, and these are all on the 230 line in that same area, that one has $168 million of additional upgrades. So, throughout this corridor, we're trying to put 1,400 megawatts of generation in a system with about 60 megawatts of load. And the system that was built to support that 60 megawatts of load. So each project that we add is just going to have, incremental upgrades. And, trying to add that level of generation to that pocket, we're just seeing huge upgrades, once you start getting to that 400 and 500 megawatt number.
Thank you for that. Are you saying that Northwestern can't quantify the benefits of resiliency, efficiency, reliability that may inure to current transmission customers or those future transmission customers?
I don't know how you would quantify, beyond capacity.
All right. One more question, I think, just to make sure that I am understanding this correctly. On Exhibit AMM1, which is the cost allocation methodology, the last sentence on the first page discusses how the upgrades included in the allocation, and I'm going to light over some words here, but will not apply to any contingent facilities or any upgrades identified for projects junior to in the interconnection queue. Is that right?
Yes.
So it would, just so I understand, it would be normal practice as part of receiving an interconnection request to identify contingent facilities, not only for senior projects in the queue, but also contingent facilities for junior projects in the interconnection queue.
No, when you do a study, you have contingent facilities from projects ahead of you in the queue. But who comes behind you in the queue, you don't know. And so no, we wouldn't have upgrades identified there.
So the upgrades for those facilities though are identified through the system impact study. Is that correct?
Yes,
And the system impacts in the process of conducting the system impact study, it would be normal for Northwestern to account for transmission service obligations that you know of.
yes,
And those transmission service obligations could come from customers who are junior in the interconnection queue.
junior in the GIA queue, yes, but if they have firm transmission service, there, it's a separate queue. And so, yes, in our study work, we do have to honor firm transmission service requests and then also NRIS interconnection requests. So when the transmission service is granted, then yes, we would include that in the modeling of the interconnection queue.
But would you include the upgrades required for that junior interconnection queue, but I guess senior firm transmission service customer? Would you include the network upgrades as contingent facilities when you're studying the interconnection request in front of you?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, if we identified upgrades on the transmission service study, would that be included? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yes, it would. We've not yet had transmission service, like a transmission service request be granted with upgrades. So like the instance with the Yellowstone generating station, there were no upgrades that were necessary. So that request was granted because there were no upgrades associated with the transmission service for that. If there were transmission service upgrades, then yes, we would include that as a contingent facility and have to identify, that those upgrades would be necessary. But to date, we have not had that.
All right. Just to make sure I understand then, are you saying that it is possible for a junior interconnection customer with exactly the type of upgrades you just described have contingent facilities reflected on a senior interconnection customer's I guess, impact study?
On a transmission service study or interconnection?
On the interconnection study.
So no, in interconnection queue, you only study your senior interconnection requests. The transmission services queue, yes, you could see that, but specifically interconnection only, then no, you would not.
Okay. All right. I think that answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Ruda, would you like to recross?
No questions.
Mr. Brown, recross.
No questions, thank you.
Northwestern, your witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one, Ms. Mueller, in questioning from Vice President Fielder, you mentioned the term LGIP. Do you recall that?
I do, yes.
Can you define for the record what LGIP stands for?
Yes, it's the large generator interconnection procedures.
No further questions.
All right, would you like to temporarily excuse this witness?
Yes, thank you, Mr.
All
Chairman.
right, Ms. Mueller, you're temporarily excused. How many more witnesses do you have?
Just one, Mr. Chairman.
And do you believe that we can finish with that witness in an hour?
I would hope so.
Very good. Well, why don't you call your next witness then?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Northwestern calls Stephen Schmidt.
Afternoon, Mr. Schmidt. I believe you were in the room when we did the mass swearing.
Yes, I
correct?
was.
All right, your witness.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt, would you please state your name, spelling your last name and your business address for the record?
Yes, Stephen Schmidt, SCHMITT, 208 North Montana Avenue, Helena, Montana.
By whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy,
What is your title at Northwestern Energy?
the manager of energy supply planning.
Mr. Schmidt, did you submit pre-filed direct testimony in this doc?
Yes, I did.
Placed before you is a document that has been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit NWER6. Please take a moment to review that and indicate when you've finished.
Okay.
Is Exhibit NWER6 a true and correct copy of your pre-filed direct testimony?
Yes, it is.
And if I were to ask you here today under oath, the same questions that are set forth in that exhibit, would your answers be the same except for any changes or modifications?
Yes, they would.
Do you have any corrections or modifications that you need to make to this exhibit?
No, I don't.
Mr. Chairman, I move for the admission of exhibit NWE R6.
Mr. Ruda,
No objection.
Mr. Brown. Seeing no objection, NWER 6 is admitted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schmidt also did pre-file rebuttal testimony in this docket, but we are not planning to move that into the record given the earlier ruling on the motion to strike. So with that, Mr. Schmidt is available for cross-examination and questioning.
Very good. Mr. Ruda.
No questions.
Brown.
No questions.
Vice President Fielder.
Mr. Chairman, just a few questions. Mr. Schmidt, I am looking at the pre-hearing memorandum that Northwestern Energy filed in this case. It states that avoided energy cost calculations are not a contested issue. Are you familiar with that memorandum?
Yes.
Does this mean that Northwestern does not oppose CED's heat rate degradation assumption?
That is correct.
Does Northwestern support CED's avoided energy cost calculations of $25.55 per megawatt hour for each of the QFs?
Yes, we noticed the commission's cost calculation of $24.99 for avoided cost of energy. And I reviewed CED's calculation of $25.55, found a difference of approximately 56 cents. And we decided not to oppose that because of the minimal nature and the change and the assumptions that were made in there, we found reasonable.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I noticed that Mr. Pankratz deferred to Mr. Schmidt on the line of question you were asking. Were you going to continue with that? I'd like to get clear.
I would gladly defer to you if you'd
Okay.
like to ask
I'll
that
go
question.
ahead. Mr. Schmidt, this line of questioning that President Brown asked of Mr. Pankratz earlier had related to pages 4 to 5 of Mr. Schiffman's rebuttal testimony. And the subject was that Mr. Schiffman was testifying that Northwestern did not employ redispatch or remediation actions that would alleviate the transmission overloads created by its modeling assumptions. Have you reviewed that testimony?
No, I haven't. Mr. Pankratz kindly deferred to me. I'm not sure I am the correct witness on answering that question. Perhaps, although I'm not sure I caught the full question at the time, so perhaps you could ask and maybe I could try to be helpful, but I'm not sure if I can.
I'll take a stab at the question, and if you can't answer, that's fair. But what
Mr.
we were
Chairman,
trying to
Sorry to interrupt. If this wasn't within the scope of his original testimony, since his rebuttal testimony is not in, I don't think it was within the scope of that. Not sure this line of questioning is permissible.
Would you like to weigh in on that?
I would just say, I think Vice President Fielder could ask the question if he's not aware of the answer. He can definitely say he does.
I agree with that reasoning.
okay.
Go ahead. Vice
So
President Fielder.
thank you. So my question is, what effect would the redispatch and remediation of other resources have on Northwestern's transmission operations and costs?
I'm not sure I can answer that. That may be more of a potential real-time kind of a question for our energy traders, and I'm not sure I really am the best witness to answer that.
Fair enough. Thank you. That's all for me, Mr. Chairman.
I'll just follow up on that question. Is that any of the witnesses that testified today
I'm not sure that any of the witnesses that are available today are the best to answer that.
okay, thank you for that clarification. Commissioner O'Donnell,
No questions.
Commissioner Bukacek?
No questions.
I do not have any questions. Mr. Hamilton, do you have any questions for this witness?
No questions.
Reed Kraus, Mr. Ruder? Mr. Brown? Your witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions.
All right. I presume you'll want to temporarily excuse this witness.
Yes, please.
Okay. Do you have any more witnesses for your case in chief?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, no, I am Western's case in chief. I rest. Reserve our right to call any rebuttal depending on CED's testimony.
All right, very good. Well, counsel, it is 4:00. I'm inclined to productively use the next hour. Perhaps, Mr. Uda, you would want to start with an opening statement if you're inclined to do so. It's my understanding you have one witness,
That's correct.
right? Did you want to give an opening statement?
Sure. I don't want to sort of redress the history of these proceedings. For those of you who don't know, I've been doing these cases in front of the commission since I think 1995. I believe every commissioner here has turned over at least 3 times since I've been practicing in front of the commission, maybe actually 4 times now. I don't kind of lost track at some point. At some point, you just look around the room and you're like, there's nobody left. And try not to take it personally because I don't think they left because of me. But I think there are a few issues in this case that divide the parties. I am gratified to hear that we're not going to have to fight again about the avoided cost of energy. But I think the main issue that isn't really addressed in Northwestern's case in chief, and I believe is still an outstanding question, is how reasonable is any of this? When they've been framing their case to you, they haven't once used the word reasonable. Okay, they act like all this stuff is dictated by studies and all this stuff is hardwired. It's really not. The point I was trying to make to you this morning, and again this afternoon with Mr. Pankratz, is their study is balanced, not within their system, the load flow study, but only by going over 2 states to northern Washington to get a reduction so that their load flow case balanced. Mr. Schiffman did the exact same thing. Okay, when you ask about why the flows are reduced at Colstrip, it's because that was to get the system to balance. You can put injections in here, put injections in there, force flows one way, force flows another way, and get pretty much any result you want. There are all kinds of ways to make things happen, and there are also all kinds of ways to make sure things don't happen. And, from the standpoint of just looking at this proceeding, there isn't very much that's reasonable about it. We're still being asked to pay for 83% of a 230 kV line because they claim they can only get 15 additional megawatts out of it. You heard Mr. Pankratz's testimony. He said that they put in 5 at a time. I asked him, well, was that because you expected it to fail? They did. They designed the load flow study and made sure it failed, and they made sure we got stuck with a big cost because they don't want QFs on their system. How I know they don't want QFs on their system, I've been fighting with them about this for more than 20 years. Every time we get a little bit of traction on some of these issues, there's always a way for Northwestern to push back. Now they've decided to use their transmission system. And honestly, to tell you the truth, we can't even look into their studies. I mean, the fact is, we can try to replicate what they did, which is what we tried to do here, but we couldn't do it because Mr. Schiffman put in 50 megawatts injections at a time and couldn't find any failures. So he got to 550 megawatts. That's a huge difference. So the reason I was going through this exercise with Mr. Pankratz is because they were manipulating these different generation points, not even their own generation points. They were manipulating the CSKT's generation points. They were manipulating Bonneville's generation points. Point is, they were manipulating. The question for you is there evidence of manipulation here? There absolutely is. How do you know that? Because the way they balanced their system was by going to a resource they don't even own that's way off their system to get a balance. And the reason they did that is that they could force flows the way they wanted to force. That's it. And the fact is, this stuff is very complicated. There's a lot to know. They have a bunch of engineers, and they're just hoping you don't ask too hard. You don't ask too many questions. You know, maybe that will be what happens. But I would suggest to you that Mr. Schiffman's study, there is nothing wrong with it. The only thing he didn't do, he used the same power flow data that they did. He used the same software they did, and he couldn't come up with their result. And the reason he couldn't come up with their result is they were manipulating the injection points all over the system. That's what happened. So let me transition to another issue. This is the issue of refund. I think there's been a misconception that we're still arguing that the discrimination here is taking place as between independent wholesale generators who are not QFs and QFs. That's not what we're arguing. Our argument is that Northwestern does not itself, its generators, pay for transmission. It folds it into its rate base. The reason it's in there and retail customers pay for it is because it's part of their cost of service. It's not any different for us. The only difference for us is this new policy they're coming up with to say, and by the way, not only do you have to pay $67 million, you have to pay for the entire cost of the line just in case. Northwestern doesn't even have to pay for any transmission, their network upgrades. They just put it in rate base. I hope people don't look too hard at it. Fact is, that's blatant discrimination. There doesn't need to be any more explanation of it. Northwestern is treating itself differently than it treats us. That's discrimination. If it gets refunded, which essentially does through ratepayer revenues, we should too. We're not any different than they are. The reason we don't have a transmission relationship with them is because QFs were never intended to be transmission customers. They were intended to be network customers, just like Northwestern's own generation. I think the other issue really comes down to, are you complying with the Supreme Court's order? If you recall, last time we had a 230 kV line that was going to run for, I can't even remember, 167 miles. And it was going to cost us $267 million. Northwestern told you with the confidence they're telling you right now that this is the right result. By God, you guys should just jump on this. And you did. And the Supreme Court looked at it and said, this is disproportionate. You guys are asking them to pay for the entire cost of a line when they have 75 megawatts. These lines can carry 500 megawatts. That's why there's been all this effort on the part of Northwestern to say it doesn't carry anywhere close to that. So we end up with $67 million for a 90 megawatt line because they're coming up with the story, trying to fit the pieces in a way to convince you not to look too hard at any of this. The truth is, what's going on here is not right. And it's not proportionate still. If you look at just a simple calculation, you took 480 megavolt rating for a 230 kV line, we'd be paying like $12 million. It's not a great deal. We have to go out and get the financing for it. And assuming we don't get refunded, we eat it. No project in the world is going to get built unless it's huge for $67 million. That's just not going to happen. And whether they say it was because they got a transmission services agreement with a project that hasn't been built and certainly hasn't been approved by the commission to include it in their study for Wheatland was an abuse of discretion on Northwestern's part. You are not supposed to study senior queued projects, junior queued projects with a senior queued project. That's why I asked that question. There isn't any prohibition on them doing cluster studies. They could fix this problem if they wanted to. They just don't want to. Because the whole goal is to keep QFs off their system. They make money. They sell from their plants, their ratepayers. They don't make money when we sell it to them. Now, the purpose is to make the ratepayer indifferent. Ratepayer is not indifferent. We're not being treated exactly the same as Northwestern's own generation. Last point I want to make is, you know, I don't agree with the commission's decision on the capacity, because I think it doesn't make a lot of sense to have two different ways of generating energy capacity. If you have a proxy resource produces both energy capacity. I respect the commission's ruling on it. I disagree with it. But what I would say is, I don't know why we would think that we wouldn't do it exactly the same way. I mean, it makes sense to me. If you're gonna use a proxy resource, use it for everything. In closing, this project might be able to make it work at $25 a megawatt hour. It will not be able to make it work with a $67 million charge tacked on. That's probably 50–60% of all the revenue. That's not even counting rate return they would ever get from this project over 15 years. It's a huge charge. And the thing is if this doesn't work and Wheatland goes away, you can be sure the next project is going to get whacked as hard or even harder. Have to come up with some sort of comprehensible ruling here that allows these projects to proceed. If not, there's just going to be a lot more, you know, unhappiness and maybe litigation. I can't predict the future, kind of out of the future prediction. But anyway, I would say that the thing that you need to pay attention to, because the Supreme Court used it twice, Wheatland order, is the word reason. How reasonable is this? And my submission to you is that it is not reasonable.
All right, thank you, Mr. Uda. What I would like to do is to have you call your witness, and then I think we can move admission of his testimony and then break for the day, and then just pick up on cross tomorrow, if that's all right with the parties.
Sounds like a great idea to me.
Thank you, commissioners. Does that sound like, all right? Why don't you call your witness, Mr. Uda?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I call Roger Schiffman to the stand.
Good afternoon, Mr. Schiffman. And I seem to recall that you were in the room and we mass swore witnesses this morning, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I was.
Okay, Mr. Uda, your witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you please state and spell your name for the record?
Name is Roger Schiffman, Roger. Last name S as in Sam, Chiffman.
By whom are you employed, Mr. Schiffman?
I'm self-employed doing business as Davis Energy Advisors.
And what is your business address?
1701 Arena Drive, Davis, California, 95618.
Okay, in this docket, did you cause to be prepared pre-filed testimony?
I did.
Do you have it in front of you?
Yes.
Could you please take a minute to review it?
Yes, I reviewed it.
And reminding you that you're under oath, if I were to pose the same questions to you today, would your answers be the same?
I have a couple of corrections, but other than that, yes.
Okay. Why don't you walk the commission through the corrections you want to make?
Sure. The corrections are both they're all with respect to the direct testimony.
Yeah, we'll go direct and then we'll go rebuttal.
Yeah, so on page 8, the last line, it refers to an avoided carbon cost of $4.64 per megawatt hour. The 464 is an error. That should read $4.20 per megawatt hour. And I believe we did make that correction in a response to Northwestern's data request NWE-R008.
Are there any other corrections?
Yes, a few others. On page RS-15, table 6. The last two lines in that table, under the line rating column, the 607.00 megawatt should read 559 megawatts. And the 658.6 megawatt should read 607 megawatts. Under the proportionality ratio, again, the last two entries, the second to last one should read 0.1342. The last one should read 0.1236. Then in the column Wheatland allocation, again, the last two entries, the second last should read 35933.820. And the last one should read 33092.266. We did address those errors in response to Northwestern's data request NWE-R016. Then on the previous page, page RS-14, some numbers from that table were cited. So in it's really the last sentence in, I guess, the second paragraph, the ratio 0.1236 should be equal to 0.1342. The fraction 75 divided by 607 should read 75 divided by 559. The ratio 0.1139 should read 0.1236. And then the fraction 75 divided by 658.6 should read 75 divided by 607. That's all the corrections that I'm aware of in either the direct or the rebuttal testimony.
Okay, well, let's go and take them one at a time. Mr. Chairman, the witness being sworn and having testified to the answers in his direct pre-filed testimony, I would move the admission of that testimony as CED R002.
Is there objection?
Mr. Chairman, our only objection is that and I understand that given the granting of the motion to strike, certain testimony from Mr. Schiffman is not part of the record. So recognizing that, we have no objection to the rest of his testimony being record.
Brown?
No objection.
Do you want to address that? All right.
I got to move excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I have to move his rebuttal testimony.
Yes, are we working on his direct testimony at this moment?
Oh, I moved its admission and, I'm sorry. I'm tired. It's getting late.
It's all right, Mr. Uda, keeping me on my toes. So, seeing no objection to CEDR 002 as revised by Mr. Schiffman, I will grant an admission of CEDR 002.
Mr. Schiffman, do you have your rebuttal testimony in front of you?
I do, yes.
Okay. And you caused that rebuttal testimony to be prepared for this proceeding?
Yes.
And if I pose the same questions to you today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Do you have any additions or corrections to make to your testimony?
None that I'm aware of, no.
I would move the admission of Mr. Schiffman's rebuttal testimony as CED R003.
Any objection?
Objection.
Mr. Brown? All right, seeing no objection, CED R003 is admitted.
The witness is available for cross-examination.
All right, I think, given our agreement earlier, what we'll do is we'll break for the day at this point in time. We will then resume at 9 a.m. tomorrow, Tuesday. And we will pick up with cross-examination of Mr. Schiffman. So seeing nothing else to deal with at the moment, we will go on. The time is now 4:20 PM. We will go off record, and as I noted, we will resume this hearing at 9 AM tomorrow.